The movie begins after a major global catastrophe when many religious groups abandon something they called the sin of speech to purify themselves. A young girl named Azrael is picking fruit, scared and constantly looking around. Her companion is a boy named Kenan. Both seem to be running from something. When she sees him trying to warm himself, she becomes anxious, quickly extinguishes the fire with a piece of cloth, and fears someone might see the smoke. Since reprimanding isn't done with words, she expresses her frustration by pushing Kenan. He follows her, feeling remorseful, and they quickly reconcile. He even receives a gift from her, a primitive bracelet made of tree branches. Soon, they hear a whistling sound growing louder. While trying to locate the source, they run in the opposite direction and attempt to hide. As the sound draws closer, they realize it isn't safe to stay. Kenan decides to find another path, and although Azrael doesn't want to part from him, she eventually agrees. Alone in the forest, Azrael becomes terrified and runs. Exhausted, she encounters a man dressed in dark clothing. She tries to escape but is confronted by his followers and quickly captured. When two men lift her to put her in a car, she becomes distraught as she sees Kenan also being captured. He tries to resist, but one of the group members pulls out a knife to ensure compliance. Both of them are thrown into the car trunk, which is locked with chains. The group continues communicating through the whistling sound. They divide into two cars. During the journey, Azrael tries every way possible to free herself but fails. When they reach a certain point in the forest, two others are waiting, facing a chair. The place appears to be some kind of sacrificial site. Everyone behaves solemnly except the victim. Azrael is dragged to the chair and forced to sit as the men tie her arms. One of the women, named Joseph, approaches Kenan with a knife and cuts his arm. The group then moves to an elevated clearing and begins performing strange rituals. They breathe and move in unison, creating rhythmic motions. The wind appears to respond to their performance, and the daylight begins to dim slightly. Above Azrael, a clothesline full of empty bottles and cans hangs, resembling a massive mobile. Moments later, something moves in the distance, but it's unclear what it is. The group's breathing becomes more erratic as the figure approaches the sacrificial site. Azrael quickly realizes they intend to offer her as a sacrifice. She fights fiercely to resist. When the creature emerges into the light, it resembles a human but with a body that appears entirely burned. Finally, Azrael manages to free one of her arms. As one of the guards rushes to secure her, he notices that a piece of the chair has broken and caught onto her sleeve. Seizing the opportunity, Azrael attacks him before he can tie her again. The man falls horribly and ends up becoming the sacrifice. The creature lunges at the man, devouring him. Without pausing to watch the gruesome scene, Azrael frees herself and escapes. The group takes a while to understand what's happening, but by then, the creature has already disappeared with their comrade. Azrael keeps running until she feels she's far enough away. Exhausted and limping, she heads to a stream to treat her injuries. Despite the relief of saving herself, the loss of Kenan weighs heavily on her. Alone and aware that the danger isn't over, she crosses the stream and gathers plant leaves to make a bandage for her arm, unaware that she's being watched. Another creature, similar to the first, approaches her. Its movements are unnatural, causing its body to sway. Azrael doesn't notice it until she hears its strange sound, which resembles a horse's neigh. This creature, however, is slower and appears blind. Azrael moves quietly, searching for a hiding spot. The creature drags itself after her, sniffing the air to locate its prey. Azrael presses on her wound to stop the scent from spreading. When the creature loses her scent, it moves away, leaving her free once again. She continues her journey and eventually notices tire tracks on the ground. Following the trail, she finds herself at some sort of campsite. The place consists of a large number of disorganized tents, with no visible people except guards. On her toes, she approaches a makeshift fence and begins removing debris to create a narrow passage. She crawls into the camp and sneaks between the tents. By chance, she bumps into something, making a noise that catches the guards' attention. Fortunately, they didn't take notice and continued their patrol. Azrael resumed her stealthy approach, hiding behind a vehicle where she spotted a crude weapon made of tree branches lying near the chains. It confirmed her worst fear: Kenan had been here. Just as she processed this realization, Josephine and one of her followers appeared. Azrael stayed hidden, observing them from a distance. She noticed Josephine attending to an older woman, clearly unwell, before heading toward a wooden structure, the only proper building in the camp. Josephine opened its door, revealing an unusual interior resembling a church. The benches were filled with worshippers moving in an eerie, synchronized manner. Primitive drawings decorated the walls, including one depicting a woman engulfed in flames. A woman named Miriam, visibly distressed, stood praying near a hole in the wall as a strange wind blew through, making a haunting sound. When the wind stopped, she extinguished the candles and turned anxiously toward Josephine. Miriam grabbed her abdomen, her expression filled with dread. When Josephine shook her head, signaling failure, the worshippers began to leave. Miriam was deeply shaken by the news and slapped Josephine in frustration, expressing her disappointment. As the church emptied, Azrael crept closer, hiding beneath the floorboards. She overheard their conversation, realizing Josephine's regret over letting the sacrifice escape. Unaware of Azrael's presence, Josephine stomped around the perimeter, searching for intruders. Azrael tried to stay hidden but winced when a creaking board gave her position away. Suddenly, Josephine's face appeared through a gap in the floorboards. Azrael scrambled, but Josephine grabbed her legs, trying to drag her out. In desperation, Azrael struck her captor and managed to escape. However, by then, the camp was in an uproar. Josephine sounded the alarm, ringing bells to alert the others, who began banging on bottles to amplify the warning. One of the men spotted Azrael running toward the fence and alerted the rest. She tore her clothes on the barbed wire but made it to the other side just in time. The man tried to follow but got stuck, and Josephine ordered the guards to shoot at Azrael. Fortunately, they missed. Exhausted and injured, Azrael ran into the forest, only stopping when she was too tired to continue. Leaning against a rock, she noticed that her hands were bleeding from open wounds. Suddenly, she became aware of a creature feeling its way along the rock, its grotesque form sending chills down her spine. Moving quietly, she tried to escape, but another, faster creature appeared. As the creature closed in, Azrael managed to trick it into falling into a pit. Relieved but still in danger, she stumbled forward, only to be blinded by a bright light from an approaching vehicle. She realized she was on the road, narrowly avoiding being run over. The driver, a stranger who spoke in a language she couldn't understand, got out and appeared concerned for her safety. His ability to speak indicated he wasn't part of the cult, making him a potential ally. Without hesitation, Azrael climbed into the vehicle, gesturing frantically for him to drive. The man, puzzled but cooperative, began asking her questions, which she couldn't answer due to their language barrier. Despite the lack of verbal communication, the man noticed her injuries and offered a bandage, attempting to comfort her with gestures. His kindness momentarily put her at ease, but she remained resolute, shaking her head firmly when he encouraged her to speak. His gaze fell on the cross pendant around her neck, prompting suspicion that the situation was far stranger than he had initially imagined. Her eyes widened with astonishment, her gaze transfixed with an almost childlike wonder when he turned on the radio, an action that revealed an undeniable truth: she had never been exposed to the magic of music before in her entire life. The experience, to her surprise, was far from unpleasant. Instead, it awakened something within her as she began to move in time with the rhythm, savoring an unusual yet blissful moment of pure joy. Observing this, the driver couldn't help but smile, a warm satisfaction spreading across his face as he realized he had stumbled upon a way to bridge the gap between them and establish an unexpected connection. Yet, just as this tender moment unfolded, an abrupt interruption occurred. A shadow darted into view, crossing in front of the windshield. The next instant, a deafening thud echoed, and a figure emerged out of nowhere. It was unmistakably one of Josephine's men, standing in the middle of the road and colliding forcefully with the car. The driver slammed the accelerator, and the car sped uncontrollably, running over the man before crashing. Azrael survived the crash but could only walk with difficulty. She was on the brink of fainting when she saw that the man who had struck the car was still alive. That was the last thing she noticed before all her energy returned in an explosive burst of rage. She attacked him, attempting to choke him with a weapon. They wrestled on the ground until they faced each other again. He pulled the trigger, but the gun appeared to have malfunctioned, so he decided to use it as a club. Azrael endured the blows with courage until she managed to reach a rock and struck his head twice. While it didn't kill him, it gave her enough time to fix the weapon. As he tried to strangle her, she adjusted the barrel of the gun and, finally, fired. She had defeated him. Moving away from the scene, she took the weapon with her. A few meters ahead, she noticed a man sitting under a tree with a fire at his feet. She remained on high alert until she got closer and recognized him. It was Cannon. He was in a terrible state, clearly in need of help. Her determination to save him made her forget all caution, leading her directly into a trap. She was lifted by a rope and found herself hanging upside down, swinging in the air. Her partner signaled with his head, indicating that someone was approaching. The guards from the camp arrived. The first thing they did was grab the weapon from the ground and strike Cannon, rendering him unconscious. But then, the wind began to howl through the trees, and the guards seemed frightened. As they scanned their surroundings, Azrael tried to push herself and grab the rope, but it didn't work. Her hand was injured, and blood was dripping onto the ground, a dangerous situation in the forest, not just for her but for everyone. Suddenly, the guards were attacked by the creatures, which appeared with shocking speed and ferocity. She realized too late that approaching people marked as sacrificial offerings was forbidden. The screams echoed through the trees as the creatures began to tear into the guards. Finally, Azrael managed to adjust herself on the rope and watched the gruesome scene unfold from above. The savagery was so intense that she couldn't even think about divine justice at that moment. Meanwhile, Cannon was still lying defenseless on the ground. When the guards were finished, the two beasts turned their attention to him. The two of them exchanged one last look of love before one of the creatures freed Cannon, while the other climbed the tree to reach Azrael. The creature chased her up the tree, its massive jaws dripping saliva inches from her face. In a final act of desperation, she managed to tie the creature with the rope and push it off the branch. Both fell, but only she landed on the ground, while the creature took her place on the noose. Lying near the fire, Azrael struggled to breathe but knew there was no time to recover. With great effort, she stood up and grabbed the weapon again. Instead of fleeing or returning to the road to find someone else who could help, she decided to go back to the camp. From behind a tree, she began to whistle, mimicking the group's communication signals. The guards, along with the man who had struck the car, had not returned, and those in the camp were still unaware of what had happened. This presented an opportunity to deceive them with the sound of a potential intruder. Her plan succeeded, and movement was seen near the fence. A man named Leon came to the front of the group with a lantern, followed closely by Josephine. Azrael whistled again, and they heard the sound, continuing to interact with what they believed to be one of their own. The group advanced into the forest, leaving the fence unguarded. Azrael then slipped through the same opening as before. The camp appeared deserted, but its inhabitants were eerily quiet, and the tents could still be full of people. She cautiously crossed the distance to the church, climbing the steps silently. She opened the door to find that the church was nearly empty. The only person inside was Mary. Azrael walked toward the altar, determined to pull the trigger, but hesitated when she saw Mary's pregnant belly. Mary was gazing at her unborn child with an angelic expression, further fueling Azrael's doubts. In a swift move, Mary disarmed Azrael and struck her forehead with a frying pan, causing her to lose consciousness. After several minutes had passed, Azrael gradually awoke and found herself being carried by both Leon and Josephine toward what appeared to be a grave. A number of individuals stood in a semicircle around the burial site, their expressions revealing their eagerness for the impending sacrifice. Leon took additional care to further smudge dirt across her face, ensuring that the creatures present would not be deceived by any inconsistencies. In the wooden coffin placed at the very bottom of the grave, Azrael was unceremoniously tossed inside, left to listen to the unsettling sound of dirt raining down upon her from above. Within the confines of a pitch-black tunnel, sinister creatures began to close in on her position, making it absolutely clear that there was no avenue for escape. Confronted with limited choices, she made the decision to venture deeper into the tunnel rather than remain in the coffin and await her inevitable fate. Crawling forward only a short distance without encountering any obstacles, she suddenly became aware of a human-shaped shadow cast against the faint light ahead and was forced to retreat. She hurried back to the coffin, only to be confronted by a terrifying creature standing at her feet. As it loomed menacingly over her and emitted a piercing howl directly into her face, Azrael instinctively mirrored its actions. Yet, the creature's behavior turned out to be unexpectedly peculiar. Instead of attempting to bite her, it extended a single finger and pressed it into her palm, transmitting a sequence of vivid and enigmatic visions. These visions overwhelmed her mind, revealing an alternate version of recent events. She saw Mary mercilessly attacking her, the church engulfed in flames, and then the creature vanished. On the surface, Leon was with his lover while Josephine visited her mother. After some time, everyone returned to their tents, feeling more at ease after the sacrifice. No one remained near the grave when Azrael pushed against the edge, lifting herself out. Inside the church, Mary was alone in the crypt, applying cold compresses. Suddenly, she heard the front door creak and heavy footsteps approaching. Fortunately, Josephine arrived to check on her well-being. However, a suspicious flash appeared shortly after, and both heard chaos erupting outside. Josephine stepped out of the church and was stunned to see her mother's tent ablaze, among others. She rushed to extinguish the flames, hoping it wasn't too late. Her companions brought buckets of water to help, and Leon rang the bell to warn everyone. While watching the fire spread, Josephine realized the blaze wasn't accidental. Seeing the first person fall, she deduced someone specific was behind the chaos. Before she could react, Leon's lover, the only one to glimpse the intruders, was attacked and became another victim of the group. Leon barely had time for a farewell as the fire consumed the camp. Josephine was injured, unable to stand, leaving only a handful of her allies barely capable of defending the small group. It became evident that Leon was the last among them. Leon spotted Azrael attempting to strike him, but both missed their targets. When Azrael started whistling again, Leon was thrown into confusion, unsure of the sound's origin. Roaring in anger, he fired at anything that moved until he saw a body fall. His triumphant smile faded upon realizing he had shot one of his own allies. Azrael took advantage of his distraction to decapitate him. She then moved quietly through the camp's ruins, passing Josephine without sparing her any attention. Now, only one person remained for Azrael to complete her revenge. Climbing the church steps with resolve, she entered cautiously. No one was there yet, but Mary emerged from hiding, armed with a sickle. Mary's first strike disarmed Azrael, initiating a chase through the church pews. Mary eventually cornered Azrael, ready to deliver a fatal blow. Azrael managed to push Mary at the last moment but couldn't hold her off for long. Despite dodging multiple strikes, Azrael finally pinned Mary against the wall and bit her neck, revealing her connection to the strange creatures. The shock was immense, especially when Mary's water broke. She fired a shot at the massive cross hanging from the ceiling. Josephine, now limping, entered the church, finding Azrael crouched behind a pew for cover. Azrael's resolve wavered as she witnessed Mary in labor. The bite mark on Mary's neck was clear, striking fear in Josephine. Azrael seized the opportunity to overpower Josephine, and a brutal fight ensued. They used the church's debris as weapons, with Mary weakening from her pain. Azrael eventually managed to trap Mary under the sickle. Mary's final moments were filled with an odd sense of peace as the cries of her newborn echoed. It wasn't long before those cries turned into a monstrous howl. Mary returned to the crypt, her eyes wide with despair as she faced the truth about what had come from her womb. She bid the world farewell in quiet surrender as Azrael left her lifeless. The eerie wind returned, and dozens of creatures gathered at the same spot in a horrific procession. Azrael approached the crypt as the newborn alternated between infant cries and demonic wails. The creatures reached the camp, some entering the church. The story concludes with Azrael emerging from the crypt, cradling something wrapped in a blanket. A tiny hand peeked out, and the creatures let out a collective cry of joy. At that moment, it became clear who the newborn truly was, a creature with a human-like body but a monstrous head with horns. Yet Azrael didn't abandon it. Instead, she embraced it as her child. And this is how the film ends. If you enjoyed the movie, please the video and subscribe to the channel.